She failed sniper school 3 times, and each time it felt like the end of a long road. She had walked with blistered feet and burning lungs, but deep down, she knew it was only the beginning, because quitting was something she had never learned. How to do, she had grown up in a town where dreams were handed out like ration cards, and then torn away the moment you reached for them. Her father, a mechanic with tired hands and silent eyes, used to say that life never gave you what you deserved, only what you demanded, and she had taken that to heart since the day he never came home from the night shift. Her mother worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, and somehow she still managed to smile at breakfast and kiss her daughter on the forehead and remind her that steel is forged in fire, not comfort. So when she set her sights on sniper school, she knew it was never going to be easy. First time she missed the final target by a few inches, her heart broke in her chest, but her face did not move. The instructor raised his eyebrows barely and said, "Better luck next time." The second time, the wind shifted last second and threw her shot off course, and she bit her tongue until it bled, rather than scream in frustration. And the third time, her scope fogged from a sudden shift in humidity, and she still made the shot. But a half-second too late, and the timer had no sympathy for her tears that never came. She stared at that blinking red clock like it was the devil himself, daring her to try again, and she almost did not. She almost turned in her rifle and walked away. Because how many times can a person run at the same wall before their bones start to give? But something held her feet to the ground, something more than pride, more than duty. It was the voice of every failure she had survived, whispering that she was not done yet. Others in the barracks called her unlucky, some called her cursed, and a few called her stubborn to the point of madness, but none of them saw the way her hands stopped shaking when she picked up a rifle, or the way her eyes narrowed like blades when she tracked a moving target, or the way she slept light as a feather with one ear open and one hand always reaching for steel. She knew she was different. She knew her instincts could not be taught, and her patience could not be measured on a stopwatch. But the rules were rules, and scores were scores, and sniper school had no room for hearts-only results. So after her third failure, she was given the option to transfer to logistics or communications, but she said no in a voice so calm it made the officer pause and look up from his clipboard. She requested frontline recon instead, a post that paid less, earned no medals, and rarely came with backup, but put her where the real watching happened, where you learn to see, not just with your eyes, but with your pulse and your breath and the quiet that crept into your bones. She was stationed on the northern range, a stretch of windblown hills and dry ravines where whispers traveled farther than words, and silence could kill just as fast as bullets. Every morning, she rose before the sun, strapped on her gear, and climbed to the highest point within patrol range, scanning every ridge and shadow until her mind merged with the terrain and her heartbeat aligned with the rhythm of the earth. Below, she failed sniper school, but every day she became more dangerous than anyone who passed. Others passed with less heart, but more accuracy, their fingers steady, their breath measured, their scopes dialed in by the textbook, but what they had in numbers, she had in hunger. And every evening while they celebrated their scores and sipped coffee in the mess hall, she stayed on the range long after the sun dipped behind the hills, lining up makeshift targets crafted from tin cans, glass bottles, and shattered helmets left from training drills. She studied wind maps, memorized terrain shifts, timed her shots to the rhythm of her heartbeat, and counted the seconds between her inhale and exhale, as if mastering that space could bend fate itself. The instructors noticed her effort, but effort did not count on paper, only results did, and they marked her as a good soldier with poor timing, a disciplined asset without the touch for perfection. She overheard them once speaking in hushed voices outside the equipment room. One of them said she had the eyes for it, but not the edge. Another said she was just unlucky, and the third said luck had nothing to do with war. She stood behind the door, her jaw clenched, her spine stiff, not because they were wrong, but because deep down a piece of her believed them, and that small splinter of doubt kept digging in every time her shot landed just shy of the mark. Still, she kept coming back, kept signing up for retests, kept logging extra hours with the rangemaster, who eventually stopped asking why she bothered and simply handed her a fresh box of rounds every morning. Her fingers were cracked and raw, her eyes red from the scope burn, and her trigger finger stiff from the cold. But she found beauty in the repetition, found a strange kind of peace in the failure that kept her sharp. And restless and chasing something most people would have given up on long ago, Shay began to notice how others relied on gear and conditions, while she relied on intuition, and feel she started spotting targets' faster tracking movement others missed, predicting the wind before it hit the flags, and hearing threats before they breached the silence. She learned to listen with her skin and see with her breath. And while the school never gave her the badge, she had already become something more than a candidate. She had become a hunter, waiting for her moment to matter one. Night, as she cleaned her rifle alone under the pale light of the field lantern, a senior officer approached. Her Hien read her file, seen her scores, watched her movements through a spotting scope, and said quietly that while she might never wear the insignia, she was not meant for the classroom, she was meant for the field. He told her about an assignment at the edge of the Northern Front, a recon unit that needed someone who could see beyond protocol, who could live in the silence and operate without praise or permission. Someone who understood that real threats did not come with warning shots or second chances. She looked at him with calm, unflinching eyes and said, "I will go." They gave her a unit patch, a ration card, a spot in the back of a transport truck, and nothing more. No speech, no congratulations, no send-off, just a set of coordinates and a mission brief with blacked out lines and timestamps written in red. The others waved her off like a ghost, already fading from their ranks. Some with pity, some with respect, and a few with quiet jealousy, because deep down they knew that while she failed the test, she had passed something much harder, something that no instructor could measure and no paper could define. She left that school behind. But the fire it lit in her never stopped burning. The instructors dismissed her, but the commander saw her fire and assigned her to a recon unit near a volatile border where silent eyes mattered more than perfect scores. The briefing was short, the location remote, a cluster of hills known for shifting alliances and sudden gunfire where the enemy did not wear uniforms and the terrain changed. Faster than the maps, she arrived in silence, dropped off by a single rotor transport with nothing but a duffel and a rifle. The other soldiers barely looked at her. Some assumed she was there for intel work. Others thought she was temporary. None of them knew she had failed sniper school, and none of them asked. She liked it that way. She spoke only when needed, moved with quiet steps, and watched everything, like a hawk circling above a world that forgot she existed. Her unit specialized in silence. They were ghosts with radios, thin lines of code between them and death. They observed supply routes, marked enemy movements, and sometimes vanished for days into the hills, coming back leaner, quieter, and more dangerous than before. The work was brutal. It required patience and instinct, and the kind of mental stillness most people lost after a few hours, but she thrived in it. Every morning before first light, she climbed to the high ridges, laid flat on her belly, and watched the world breathe. She learned the sound of distant footsteps, the difference between a farmer and a fighter, the way a shadow moved when a rifle was hidden beneath a cloak. She memorized every rock, every dead tree, every bend in the road, until she could navigate it blindfolded. They started calling her Hawkeye not because of her past, but because of the way she spotted things no one else did. Once she saw a shimmer behind a sandbank and called it out just before the enemy launched a mortar. Another time, she noticed a pattern in goat-herding routes and uncovered a smuggling network feeding arms into the region. She never boasted, never spoke of her sniper school record, never even told them her real scores. And when one of the newer soldiers asked where she trained, she simply said, "Long enough," and kept cleaning her rifle in silence. She had a partner, an older spotter named Reyes, who had been in the field since before her first deployment. He watched her with curiosity at first, then with trust, and finally with respect. After a mission where they were nearly overrun and she found an escape route no map had ever marked, Reyes asked her over a shared ration pack why she never tried again for the badge. She shrugged and said, "I do not need a pin to do my job," and that was the last time it was ever mentioned between them. Her reports became sharper, her calls more precise, and eventually command began routing special missions through her team, the ones with no margin for error and no room for glory, missions where someone had to crawl 2 miles on their stomach through mud and barbed wire just to confirm a single target still breathed. Her hands grew calloused, her mind razor sharp, her emotions filed down to a blade she could sheathe at will. Every day she got better, every week she saw more, and every month she edged closer to something she could not name, but always felt just beyond reach. She knew something was coming, something bigger than border skirmishes or supply routes. Something with weight, something that would test her in ways no range could prepare her for, and she welcomed it not because she wanted the recognition, but because she wanted the truth, the real test, the one no school dared to give, and when it came, she would be ready. Because she had already lived through failure and risen from it, and that kind of fire does not go out, it only waits. She became the shadow behind the scope, tracking threats, calculating wind shifts, spotting danger, before others even noticed movement. Her rifle stayed holstered, but her mind was always locked on target. Her job was not to shoot, but to see, and she did it better than anyone. She could sit still for hours, unmoving, unblinking, her face painted in dirt and dusk. Her eyes scanning the world through high-powered optics and instinct, watching too long a reflection where there should be none, and every time she reported it, her intel was clean, her details exact, and her timing perfect. Command started to notice, and so did the unit. They never said it aloud, but they started trusting her calls without question. If she said take cover, they dropped flat. If she said stay low, they moved like ghosts. If she said sniper east, they didn't look to confirm. They fired, and they ducked, and they lived, because she had not been wrong once. And in a world where one mistake could end the mission, that kind of certainty was sacred. Reyes joked that she had a third eye in her skull. Did not believe in magic, only training, only time, only the hours she put in when others were sleeping, and the pain she endured when her elbows bled from stone in her neck, ached from holding her head still for too long in the heat and the silence den. One day, it changed. The mission was routine. A general was flying in to inspect a forward base, and her team was sent to recon the area, mark potential threats, and report back within 6 hours. It was not supposed to be dangerous, but the terrain was unfamiliar, and the town nearby had gone quiet in ways that felt wrong. The kind of quiet that hums beneath your skin and makes your bones lean forward. Even when your brain tells you to relax, she said it out loud during the sweep. This place is too clean to still. Reyes nodded, but they both knew command would ignore the gut feeling of two scouts over the polished itinerary of a visiting general, so they did what they were told. They marked the buildings, they tagged potential sniper nests. They swept the market square and the narrow alleys, and they noted where the power lines had been cut and where fresh tire marks led to the hills, but their report was flagged as cautious, not critical, and the general's visit remained on schedule. Night she could not sleep, not because of nerves, but because of noise. The wrong kind of noise, too quiet to exact the wind, moving just a little too consistently, the air just a little too still. Her instincts screamed at her, but her orders were clear: observe, report, and stand down unless otherwise engaged. She hated that line. Unless otherwise engaged, as if war had ever waited for promotion. She cleaned her gear slowly, methodically, checking every latch, every scope setting, every round. Counted them twice, then sat on the roof of the forward outpost as the convoy rolled in engines. Low radios, hissing with static. Reyes sat beside her, chewing on dry rations and watching the ridgeline with the same suspicion. She did not say it aloud, but she knew something was wrong. She could feel it in the way the sun dipped too fast behind the hills, and in the way the birds had vanished from the sky, and in the way her own hands started to tremble, not from fear but from recognition, because somewhere out there was a threat, and it was already watching. Then came the mission. A top general flown in to inspect a disputed zone when the convoy hit a kill zone. Bullets cracked. The air chaos unfolded, and the team scrambled to survive. It happened faster than thought, faster than breath. One moment the vehicles were rolling steady tires, crunching over gravel dust rising in slow swirls, and the next moment it was death from every angle. Rifles flashing from rooftops, the sharp hiss of suppressed fire slicing the stillness, and panic blooming like fire and dry brushy. And Reyes had been stationed high on the north, walled their position, giving them a wide view of the convoy route and the buildings beyond it. She was already tracking rooftops when she saw it, a glint just before the first shot. Not sunlight, not glass, something sharper, something wrong. She opened her mouth to call it out, but the bullet hit before the word escaped. A driver slumped forward, the lead vehicle veered and slammed into a concrete barrier, and the air filled with shouting and screams. Snipers, she yelled into the comms, but the line was jammed, filled with static and broken voices. Reyes grabbed his rifle, eyes wide, scanning the rooftops, but he could not see where it was coming from because the shots were coming from angles that made no sense, east, then west, then north, like the enemy was everywhere and nowhere all at once. She forced herself to breathe steady, to fall into the rhythm she had practiced for years. To slow the moment down, in her mind she reached for her spotting scope, but something in her gut told her, no, not this time. This time it was not about watching. This time it was about acting. She glanced at Reyes, and in his expression, she saw what she already knew: the lead sniper was down, the spotter was wounded, and the unit was leaderless, trapped under fire with no eyes and no direction. The general was still alive, crouched behind the third vehicle, guarded by two men who looked young and too afraid to shoot. The rest of the convoy had scattered, some diving behind walls, others pinned flat on the road, unable to move because the enemy was too precise. This was not a random attack. It was planned, choreographed, a trap laid by someone who knew exactly when and where the general would arrive. She cursed under her breath, picked up the downed sniper's rifle, and crawled to the edge of the roof, low and deliberate. Every move calculated, every breath measured. Reyes did not stop her. He only nodded once because he understood. 2. She was the only one who could see this through, the only one who had trained for a moment like this even. If the badge had never been pinned on her uniform, her fingers curled around the grip, and it felt familiar, like coming home to a weapon that knew her just as well as she knew it. She scanned the horizon, eyes darting from building to hilltop to broken window, until she saw it again, that flicker, that breath of light reflecting off something smooth, far out beyond the ridge, a place no one should have had access. Toit was a kill shot location, elevated, covered, angled perfectly for eliminating a high-value target in one shot, and that target was the general. Her heart pounded, but her hands stayed steady. The sound of gunfire below faded into silence. Her breath slowed, and in that moment she was not a failure, not a reject, not someone who almost made it. She was a sniper, and she was about to take the shot that no one else could. Pinned down on a rooftop with no exit, and their sniper already taken by a bullet to the neck. She felt a silence in her bones, and a decision burn through her veins. She did not ask for permission. She did not wait for backup. She simply moved with the clarity of someone who had trained for failure so long that danger felt like a second skin. She slid her body flat against the rooftop gravel, digging into her elbows. Her knees scraped raw, her breath steady and controlled like the wind before a storm. Her eyes locked on that distant glint, that shimmer, that scream without a sound. Round her the base was unraveling, soldiers firing wildly from behind sandbags, some trying to move the general to better cover, others frozen, not knowing where to aim because the enemy was not close. It was hidden, tucked into the folds of the land with elevation and silence, as its allies, one shot every 30 seconds, precise and deadly each time. Another man fell, and still no one had seen where it came from except Hershey, traced the angles in her mind, calculated the distance between her position and the far ridge, factored the drop, the wind, the curvature of the land, and the heat shimmer rising like ghosts between them. It was too far for a clean shot, too far for anyone who had passed the test with a score just high enough to make it through, but not too far for her because she had failed too many times not to know every variable. By instinct, she adjusted the fallen sniper's rifle with hands that moved like water, fluid, silent, exact. She dialed the scope to clicks to compensate for elevation. 3 more to balance the crosswind, and then she waited. Because a sniper knows that 1 second too soon is still too late, and she needed that glint again, that confirmation, that breath of metal in sunlight, and there it was again, just for a heartbeat. A shimmer on the edge of shadow. She exhaled slowly, her finger resting on the trigger, not pressing, just knowing it would move when it needed to. Her eyes narrowed, her world narrowed until it was only the target and her heartbeat and the space between them. She thought of nothing, not of the badge she never earned, not the instructors who doubted her, not the war or the general or even Reyes crouched just behind her. She thought only of the Shatan. Then she took it. The rifle cracked louder than thunder in her skull. Her shoulder absorbed the force, her scope blinked, white from the muzzle flash, and then steadied again just in time to see the enemy sniper jerk back and vanish from sight, the glint gone, the ridge, still the silence absolute, and then the firing stopped, like someone cut the sound from the world for a moment. She did not move, she simply listened to the echo fade, watched the distant ridge through her scope, waited for any sign of movement. There was none. The shot had landed clean and final, and somewhere, down below, the general was still alive because of Atreus let out a breath behind her like he had been holding it since the war began, and said quietly, "Well, damn, I guess they trained the wrong one." And she did not smile. She only nodded once, slid the rifle back into position, and stared out at the horizon like it might still be hiding. Something more, because she knew this was not the end, not yet. Through swirling dust and echoing fire, she caught a faint shimmer on a distant ridge. Not a glint to most eyes, but to hers it screamed threat, and she whispered, "I see you." The world around her had blurred into motion, and chaos voices shouting orders. Bullets slicing air radio static, tangled with screams, but inside her mind everything had slowed down to a crawl. Her heart beat like a metronome, her thoughts sharp and quiet, like the inside of a storm. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. As they tightened around the trigger, could feel the recoil before it even came, because she knew this shot like she knew her own name. The position the enemy had taken was nearly perfect elevation foliage, partial cover distance, over 1,000 yards, with wind funneling between the cliffs and shifting every few seconds. But she had trained for the unpredictable. Her failures had taught her more about variables than any manual ever could. She made 3 tiny adjustments on the scope, reading the trees instead of the flags, measuring shadows instead of numbers, then took one long, slow breath and held it in her chest like a secret her. Target had not moved, not fully, just a shift of weight, the tilt of a barrel, a flicker of light off the scope. That was all she needed. She had seen that same mistake before, the arrogance of stillness. The overconfidence of a perfect nest, but the world never stops moving, and neither does a trained eye. She steadied her body, pressed her cheek into the stock, closed one eye, and let her soul settle into the cold steel of the rifle. Then she pulled the trigger. Time, broke. The sound was sharp and final and clean. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the dust leaped from the rooftop like it had been punched. By God, she stayed locked in position, eyes in the scope, tracking the result. And then she saw it, the spray of red, the collapse of a figure into the dirt, the sniper down without warning, without glory, without time to even react. The ridge fell silent. And in that silence, everything changed. The team below began to move again, not in panic this time, but in rhythm. The general was pulled to safety. The remaining soldiers shifted formation, regained. Their nerve fired only where it counted now, because they knew the worst of it was over, and the one holding the ridge was gone. Reyes tapped her shoulder once, his voice low and stunned. "You just saved a general," without even blinking. She lowered the rifle, set it gently on the rooftop, and finally allowed her hands to shake just a little, not from fear, but from release. She looked across the hills, watching for a second. Shooter watching for movement, watching for anything that might suggest it was not over, but all she saw was the wind returning to its usual speed, and the birds slowly coming back into the sky, and she knew that. For now the danger had passed. No one on that rooftop said the word sniper, and no one talked about her record or her failures, or why the best shot of the day had come from someone without a badge, because in war none of that mattered. What mattered was the result, and the result was that one shot had saved the mission, and maybe even the war. She remained silent, her face unreadable as always, but inside something had shifted. Not pride, not vindication, something older, something quieter, something earned. The story of that shot would begin to spread before the dust had even settled. She grabbed the fallen rifle, breathed once, let the world go still, and pulled the trigger. The shot flew like a promise, slicing the air, finding the enemy's skull with a thud that silenced the battlefield. And in that moment, everything changed. Because it was not just a shot, it was a declaration. It was the moment when everything she had trained for, failed for, bled for, finally met purpose. The rooftop was quiet now, but the base below had begun to stir, voices, returning footsteps, cautious. At first, then stronger, the crack of her rifle, still echoing through their bones. She did not celebrate, she did not even smile. She remained prone behind the scope, watching the ridge, in case there was another shooter, another glint, another sign that it was not over, but nothing came. No shadows, no movement. Just the slow return of wind brushing the dust back into patterns, and the sound of breath returning to lungs that had forgotten how to use it. Reyes crouched beside her, eyes still wide with disbelief, not because she made the shot, but because of how she made it, without hesitation, without panic, with precision. Born not from medals, but from pure, brutal experience, finally lowered the rifle, her hand steady now like the weapon had pulled the fear out of her bones and replaced it with steel. Reyes reached out and took the rifle from her, slowly, as if it were something sacred, something legendary, and handed her back her own, as if returning a crown, and she nodded once, and Thanks not needing words because Reyes understood what the others would not, that this shot did not come from talent, it came from failure. It came from being broken and remade in fire. That few had ever felt down below the general was moving again, escorted by soldiers who now looked up at the rooftop with awe. Not confusion, they had heard the shot. They had seen the kill, they had felt the shift, and when command asked who had taken the shot, Reyes only said she did, and they did not question it. Not after what they had seen, not after watching her climb down the rooftop calm and silent, moving through smoke and spent casings. Like a ghost later, much later, she stood alone in the armory, wiping down her gear like she always did, each piece of her rifle cleaned and inspected as if it were still her first day in the field. The light was dim, the room quiet, except for the soft clink of metal and the rhythm of her breath. Then the door opened, and a major stepped in, his uniform sharp, his boots spotless, but his eyes tired from what he had witnessed. He did not speak at first, he just watched her movements, the way she worked, like a machine with soul. Finally, he said, "That was one hell of a shot," and she looked at him without expression. Not disrespect, just silence, and he continued, "I read your file, you were never supposed to be on that rooftop, not with that rifle," and she said, "I was where I needed to be," and he nodded, because there was nothing else to say, nothing else that mattered. Not scores, not failures, not qualifications, just the fact that the general was alive, and the threat was gone, and it had been her, not anyone else, who had made that true. He asked her one last question before leaving, "Do you still want the badge?" And she paused for a long moment before answering, "No, because I earned something more." And with that, the door closed behind him, and she returned to her work. Her hands steady, her breath calm, and her place in the world forever changed by one shot. No one else could make